Morning. So Jamie had suggested that in preparation for our exam, we look at some of the specifications content and particularly the mark scheme for questions that you'll get, A, B, C, D questions in your assessment. So just to remind you, there's assessment objective 1 and 2 that make up 50% of your paper. And this is true for both the beliefs and values aspect of the paper and kind of religious practice. So let's go into some detail. Just to remind you of the outline of the course, we are now on section 1 and we are pretty much covered section 1. What I'd like to do this year, ideally, is to get well underway with section 2, and that would leave us 3 and 4 to do in the run-up to the mocks and a little bit beyond that, and then we could get into doing past paper questions, because that's where the real consolidation work of getting you up to 8s and 9s is going to be about, particularly plugging in religious texts, that's quoting bits of the Bible, an awareness of denominational diversity, what are the distinctions between the Church of England, the Catholic Church, Baptists, Pentecostals, having an awareness of diversity in that sense, and an awareness of diversity about how people interpret the Bible, from liberals to fundamentalists and everything in between. That is the kind of nuance that they're looking for in 8s and 9s. So together with that, when we get into the practical ethics, you're going to need to know a fair amount of technical terminology, for instance, over human rights and over global trade or capital punishment, crime. And this will come quite naturally to you as we talk through these topics, but it's something that we need to press on with. So we have kind of covered these areas. To be honest, this section is by far the most nebulous, kind of cloudy of the 4 topics. Once you get into this here, you're into medical ethics, abortion and euthanasia, marriage and family life, more kind of sociological, childlessness and celibacy, the use of in vitro fertilization, capital punishment and war and peace. They're all quite concrete issues to get to grips with. So they're a lot clearer to understand and less abstract. So if you've been finding parts of this quite complex, like determinism and free will, then don't worry, it will get a lot more substantive as we go through the course. So that's where we are. Last year we looked at religious texts, the Bible, how it's interpreted, founders and leaders, particularly the life of Jesus, Paul, the expansion of Christianity, a bit of the history of the Christian church, festivals and celebrations, particularly Easter, and Christmas and Pentecost, places of pilgrimage. We looked at Rome, we looked at Lourdes, Medjugorje. I talked about the Camino de Santiago, the pilgrimage in Spain, northern Spain, and to Santiago de Compostela. And then we looked at places of worship, churches and forms of worship, liturgical and non-liturgical. So we have all that to revise and come back to. And that won't be the focus of our summer exam. Rather, it will be section 1 that will be the focus of the summer exam. So this is the kind of format we'll be looking at. It's a kind of 1 lesson exam, although we could do 2 papers. I know that some of you were anxious that it was only a 1 lesson exam, so I wouldn't want to shortchange you there, he says with a note of facetiousness in his voice, but in preparation for that we'll do lots of revision, and in feedback for that we'll look at exam technique. So in the whole package of things, I think we won't lose out too much in your preparation as compared to sitting in a formal context where you're sat next to someone maybe in year 9 in a class and it's all like an exam format, but you'll be under pressure of time. So some of you have been doing amazing answers but immensely detailed, and you might need to just curb that a little bit and cut your cloth to suit your time, as it were. So we're going to look now at the format of these questions. And there are kind of 4 types of questions that we'll come to look at. A, B, C, and D, obviously. So A is just identify. It's dead straightforward. You know, do you know the facts? Identify 3 examples of greed, hatred, and ignorance, and you know, just factual statements. You don't go into detail. You don't waste time. Just give the information. But another type of question is the C-type question, which is asking you to explain, and it's 6 marks. And explain 3 ways in which the world appears to be designed. You've done this question. So evolution could not have happened by accident, as it's far too detailed. For example, the food chain. I think there's a problem in sort of setting up design and evolution as polar opposites. Theistic evolution wants to see order even in the process of evolution. Now, that's not without its problems, because evolution, of course, is red in tooth and claw. There's lots of competition and violence, and it's perfectly explicable in natural terms. It doesn't need supernatural agency. It doesn't need God to kind of account for it. But you shouldn't always see evolution and creation or design as oppositional. You could marvel at the elegance of evolution and its ability to generate complexity through processes, natural processes, and even suggest that that is the handiwork of God. Of course, non-religious thinkers would say, well, that's an explanation too many, because you've got a perfectly exhaustive explanation of how you get from primitive amoeba to complex human life without any divine agency or God. The human body is clearly designed. So a lot of scripture would say things like, for we are fearfully and wonderfully made. You knit me together in my mother's womb, Psalm 139. So that's something that Paley marveled at. The human eye alone, he said, would prove design. And for all the scientific explanations, often people have a very strong intuitive sense that there's beauty, there's order, there's design in the universe. Beauty is another aspect. We talk about Fibonacci sequences in plants and nature, which are these kind of mathematical patterns where you kind of halve things, and you can see them online. That might point to God. I mean, beauty could be accounted for in evolutionary terms as kind of a peacock showing its feathers in order to get a mate, to highlight its genetic materials for reproduction. But there's an excessive beauty that seems to speak of a creator that revels in that for the theist. And you can evaluate Paley's watch analogy and suggest either that that's an imperfect one, it's disanalogous with the world, or with the eye, because unlike a watch, which either tells the time or doesn't, half an eye is of some use, because it can tell you that there's light and there's darkness. It can help enable a fish to move upwards towards the air, and a primitive lens can help you detect a predator and live long enough to pass on your genes to future generation. So the D questions are where the big marks are, and that's what you need to concentrate your time on. It's always important to remember, I think you've only got one of these in the exam, so you don't have to worry too much about running over time and then losing on your first question and losing on your D mark answer on the second question. But A's are identify, just name 3 examples of moral evil like murder, bullying, and hitting someone. And outline asks for some detail where you need to show a degree of understanding. And then D is where the evaluative content is in some detail. So here students must underpin their analysis and evaluation with knowledge and understanding. and go into some detail. So this question's about if God is all-powerful, how can humans have free will? Well, if God is totally sovereign over people's choices, doesn't that make people into puppets, it's saying? There's a question about whether, if God is completely sovereign, is that a zero-sum game, that all the sovereignty is with God? Humans have no freedom or independence of thought in that. So to get a 10, you need to demonstrate sustained and accurate and thorough understanding of religion and belief, critically deconstruct the issues in the question, unpick the wording, be very attentive to the exact wording that's given in a question. Here's Mr. Farr's structure for a D mark, a D question, as we've talked about before. In this essay, I will demonstrate, state your thesis at the beginning, and then have your point explanation example. Don't forget examples. They illustrate points very well. Evidence is the rigor that convinces and persuades your reader, but the example is what illustrates your point, and it can also be persuasive and capture your reader's attention. Counter-arguments are your friends. Always lay down a counter-argument that you can then reply to. This argument is weak. I disagree. It should be rejected. It's flawed. These are all evaluative terms, and you need to use this language quite deliberately. It's not enough to say, it's my opinion that. You need to make a critical judgment. So weak, disagree, rejected, strength, flawed, they all show independence of thought, critical engagement with the question, analysis and evaluation. So without them, you're not going to get higher up. You need to use the language explicitly in your answer. And you need to repeat this 2 to 4 times. You bring up argument, counter-argument, response, argument, counter-argument, response. It's a bit like a kind of tennis match with a to and a fro. And all the time, you're seeking to persuade the reader of what you said you would demonstrate at the beginning. It's a bit like, here's the double glazing that we have. We're not the cheapest in the business, but we are the best. We have been around for 20 years. Other fly-by-night providers will be, gone tomorrow, and you won't be able to come back and say, look, the double glazing you put in 5 years ago isn't working, it's leaking now, and we'll come back and do a repair. That's what you're paying the extra for. So the argument, counter-argument, response acknowledges counter-arguments. Someone might be cheaper, but it replies effectively. So that's one thing I wanted to share. And another thing I wanted to share was this is a redacted script from the board here. And what you've got is, this is a paper on Christianity. So we've got, I think you've done this one here, 3 examples of moral evil, 2 characteristics of God. He's omnibenevolent, all good and forgiving, omnipotent, all powerful. Just about enough there. I'd like to see a little bit more detail. 3 ways in which the world appears to be designed. Creatures on it, e.g. camels, have evolutionary adaptations that help them perfectly be adjusted. Well, I suppose camels do carry immense amounts of water with them and can live in desert areas very successfully. The world is full of material wonders, e.g. the Grand Canyon, and this can be made by somebody conscious and aware of the world. Legibility, I think, is an issue for this candidate, so just be aware that this is all scanned in the real thing onto a screen, and your examiner will be reading this on a screen. So what's illegible on paper becomes even more illegible on the screen. They will make every effort to read your wording, but you need to go into some detail. So this is the question on free will. And then there's a question on identify 3 beliefs about the origins of the universe. There was nothing in time and space, just a singularity. Quantum fluctuations caused singularity to expand in what's known as the Big Bang, creating the universe. There was nothing in space and time, and an omnipotent entity known as God created the universe and the world in 7 days and nights, created in the 6 days, rested on the seventh. The universe was created out of the parts of the body of Purusha, creating the 5 castes in Hindu society. Okay, so quite a wide range of beliefs, and interestingly, that candidate's brought in some Hindu belief there. That's perfectly valid. 3 accounts. 2 teachings about greed in the religion you studied. To have material possessions is a source of much evil according to the Bible, the root of all evil. Well, that's not strictly true. The love of money is the root of all evil. When you make money an end in itself rather than a means to an end. The greedy is also to be greedy is to ensure suffering in hell after death. According to Jesus, it's harder for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. Okay, so some kind of a response there. Not sure that I get entirely for, but he is giving a quote from the Bible there, and a slight misquote from the Bible there. So you see, you have to do that. Explain 3 beliefs about free will. First of all, it's given by God to human beings so that we can choose whether to follow God. Another quote from Deuteronomy. We need to perhaps give you banks of quotes at some stage for you to learn, like you would in an English literature text. So yeah, let's have a look at a D question. So here's the D question. God caused the world to exist. Do you agree? I disagree. As science and technological innovations here show, it is the Bible account, so it's highly flawed and false. The world was invented 14 billion years ago, not 6,000 years ago, for example. Therefore, this shows that God most likely did not exist in the Bible. Supposedly, the word of God is shown to be wrong. Okay, another person might also disagree because they believe that every event has a cause. I think I'd get rid of the also, because that implies that it's the same view as your own, whereas this is the counter argument here. Another person might disagree because they believe the event has a cause from personal experience, earthquakes, from seismic activity. Therefore, they believe that the universe must have been derived from an infinite loop of events, and believe in an oscillating universe and not in God. Okay, so that they are saying it also disagrees. A Christian might disagree because the Bible states that God and the world and the universe in 7 days were made. Okay, there's a whole load of stuff that's wrong about this. So Christians, 2.1 billion people, don't all take that view, that the world was made in 6 days, sometime 6,000 years ago, is a fundamentalist view that you might get many people holding in the Bible Belt of the United States, in Texas, and so on, but you wouldn't get universally across the world. Many people would be theistic evolutionists who see God operating through mainstream science, or what mainstream science has discovered in the laws of nature, and don't see any conflict. And I would like to have seen the candidate bring out the diversity of views there. If you just kind of lump all Christians in as a kind of monolithic view, then you're going to get low marks. And this candidate is going to get low marks out of 12 here. He's also put forward 2 disagreements, and there's not much of this argument, counter-argument, reply business going on. He's given some fair arguments here. I think getting your teeth into the causal argument, you could say things like, it's an assumption that because everything in our experience has a cause, therefore the universe itself must have a cause. That's called the fallacy of composition. To assume what's true of the parts is true of the whole. To say, I don't know, I'm Irish, Patrick works on a farm, Seamus works on a farm, Richard works on a farm, therefore all Irishmen are farmers. That would be a fallacy of composition. And this is a fallacy of composition. Other things, God caused the world to exist. We, David Hume, the philosopher, says, weren't there at the beginning of the universe. What would we know? We can observe people building, architects and builders building houses, but we weren't there at the beginning of the universe, says Hume. So we can't really infer or elicit or speculate about the origins of the universe and say this is how it was caused. So that's fairly poor. So I think this question here is going to be down in the kind of 6s and 7s, really. I mean, he's mentioned the oscillating universe here. He's kind of put forward his view, but it's here's one view, here's another view, that's the end of it. But that's not analysis and evaluation. Analysis and evaluation is where you bring contrary arguments into engagement with one another, and you seek to persuade your reader that having considered contrary positions, your own view is still the most rigorous in terms of evidence and examples. And he hasn't, or she hasn't done that in this instance. So that would score a pretty weak mark. The next section is section 2, so I won't go on to that. So I think it's pretty clear what you've got to do. Identify is something that's basically give factual examples of. Outline, you've got to give some level of understanding, and this is immensely brief. The number of lines kind of indicate the depth you should be going into to some extent, and you've got plenty of time in this exam to be doing it. On the next section, which is identify, outline, explain, you need to go into some greater detail there. And that explain, we're looking for some real understanding, some biblical quotes ideally, or some technical terms, again, an awareness of diversity, some nuance to what you're saying, very close attention to the wording, some technical phrases and terms that indicate a high level vocabulary. And then where the real questions are, I mean, just think 12 marks as opposed to 3, 4, and 6. So 13 for the rest of the questions. Half of the question, 50% really of the paper, is about evaluation. And that's why you've got to follow the kind of grid, the kind of template that Mr. Farr has offered there. So hopefully that explains something of the style of this exam. We'll do some practice, some more revision as you come up to look at it. And if you've got questions, do post them up on the chat on Microsoft Teams, and I'll go through those. Obviously, the questions we'll be putting up will be different for your exam. They'll be unseen, but they'll be along the same lines in terms of A, B, C, and D structure. So I hope, Jamie, that answers your question to some extent.